Well, good morning, everybody. I'm DeShazo, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our first panel discussion of the day. I was 7 years old when the oil embargo started, and for the folks that are younger than I am in the room, in response to the fourth Israeli-Arab war, OPEC decided to, in October of '73, to place an embargo on a set of countries, which included the U.S. And gas prices went up the equivalent from $3 today to $12 tomorrow, all of a sudden. And that lasted through March of the following year. So it wasn't that long, but prices stayed high. And then to kind of, the cherry on top was, 5 years later in '79, there was a second kind of oil shock as a result of the Iranian Revolution. And so the U.S. has been at the mercies of geopolitics and geopolitical events beyond its control for most of its energy history. And today we have a chance to talk about the progress that the U.S. has made and its sort of assess its strategies towards meeting its own energy needs and energy independence this morning. And I have two panelists with really tremendous expertise in two different areas. And so I want to start off by asking Dr. Michael Weber to talk a little bit about what was the best policy response and the sort of the worst policy response the U.S. had to the embargo.
That's funny. So in the 1970s, I just talked about this in an energy security lecture yesterday for a class, so some students in the room might hear some of the same comments, but it's important to remember how the 70s really shaped decades of thinking in the United States and around the world, because that was the first time we really understood the vulnerability we had to supply chains for oil especially. Although there have been other crises in the 50s with the Suez crisis, there have been other supply cutoffs, but none quite as significant as the ones in the 70s. And so that transformed thinking, and I was also alive, and I remember being in lines waiting for gasoline, and a gasoline station would have a green flag, yellow flag, or red flag to let you know they had gasoline or were low on gasoline or were out of gasoline. And so I remember that, and I remember sort of the fear of this sort of put into American consumers at least. And there are a couple other elements to keep in mind. One is U.S. oil production had peaked in 1970, 71. So U.S. oil production domestically was declining at the time our imports were that's growing to make up for the decline as well as for the growth of the economy and everything else. And so our sense of vulnerability was growing, and then the cutoffs just kind of drove that home. And we responded in the United States with a couple of things. We created a lot of efficiency standards, fuel economy standards for cars and appliances. Those were good things. We created the Department of Energy and the Energy Information Administration. We thought, well, maybe we should track what's going on. We never really tracked what was going on, so we created agencies with the U.S. government ability to collect data so we knew what was going on. And we pushed really hard for coal and nuclear because we had just built up a power sector that really consumed a lot of oil for electricity. So like 17% of the power sector in the 70s use oil. Today it's like 0.5%. So we lose a lot of oil for power, and we decided we could maybe go without oil to drive to work, but could not go without oil for the power sector. The power sector is too important for food preservation. So we got oil out of the power sector and built coal and nuclear. The same coal plants we're trying to shut down now, by the way. So coal plant owners will say, you asked us to build them in the 70s, now you asked us to shut them down. So that was a security play, but we also, I would say most of the efficiency plays were good. DOE is fine, EIA is fine, nuclear and coal were fine at the time. We also did very expensive things like synfuels, trying to extract liquids out of coal that look today very expensive and awkward. So that wasn't such a great policy response. And our response is different than, say, in France, which was going all nuclear. So different countries responded different ways. In some of those responses we live with today in good ways, and some we're trying to shut down because we think they might have solved a security problem but introduced a greenhouse gas or air quality problem, said the coal plants in particular. Yeah. So things we're still living with the legacy of that, but now we have some different tools in our toolkit, especially based on what Ezra showed us in the prior talk.
So talk a little bit about how the shale revolution, which kind of snuck up on the oil and gas industry in a sense, it feels like the energy sector was never anticipating that would happen, and then suddenly it did. How did it change the geopolitics?
So the shale revolution has been very good for especially U.S. geopolitics, but geopolitics in general, because now our production's on the upswing, we're setting records, we're net exporters, we're less dependent or less vulnerable. So when you have massive wars happening, we did not see an oil price this time the way we would have seen 50 years ago. So it seems like there's a more stable force out there with swing production coming from shale formations. And so our conditions are fundamentally better in the United States. In the 70s, we said we should not export energy because we keep it for ourselves for security reasons. And now we say we should export energy for security reasons. Our arguments have flipped because the shale revolution has enabled such a different sense of abundance of the resource. So our security situation is so much better now than 70s. We see that in the imports and exports. We see it in the prices. We see it in the other emissions benefits and everything else. And that was also partly in response to the 70s oil crises, though it took a while. So George Mitchell and others trying to experiment with extracting oil and gas from shale formations. They were doing that in the 70s, in the 80s and 90s. It took a while to figure it out, and then it really took off. And I think the turning point for me, when I really understood shale was a phenomenon, was around 2008. I first heard about it in 2007, and I think you're right, a lot of the majors weren't really active in it, but some different mid-majors or independents were. And so if you looked at what the gas industry was saying in 2007 or 8, they would say, gas prices are high, and they're going to be high forever. So even the gas industry didn't understand what was about to happen to gas prices and everything else. So that was partly just really good innovation, partly good government policy to pay for some of the R&D. There were a variety of things that came together to make that happen, and we're in a much better situation today as a consequence.
Great. So that's at the macro level. So Buzz Smith, you're an expert on electric vehicle, the transition, the vehicles. You I think, won Chevrolet's Salesperson of the Year or meritorious mention for 13 years, and you've sold more EVs in Texas than anybody else in 1 year. Help us understand how, as we think about the transportation sector, the shift from carbon-based oil and gas fuels to electricity affects our energy independence.
Affects what?
Our energy independence.
Well, the energy independence, if we're using, especially with Texas, we have such great wind and solar capabilities that the move to electricity for transportation lets us take that resource that we've got and start really being strategic about it. We've got this strategic oil reserve that we typically, the government will open it up when the price of, well, like in the Russia invasion of Ukraine, gasoline went to $5 a gallon. So we open up the strategic reserve, really for probably political reasons more than anything else. And so now we can really be strategic about this. And it's important that as we move to electricity, my experience selling cars was about 1 year after somebody bought an EV from me. If they owned their own home, they'd come back in and say, well, tell me about the solar panels on your house. And so I would tell people, I've got my refinery on the roof and I've got my service station in my garage. I don't have to go anywhere else for this stuff. Every day when I leave home with a full tank. So, if I'm in Houston, for instance, there's a hurricane coming in, everybody else is lined up at the gas station. I'm on the road, hauling ass back to Dallas-Fort Worth. So it's a completely different lifestyle that people aren't used to, but it gives us energy independence because we can take that resource and save it for the important things. And driving isn't one of the important things. It's an everyday thing. It's not a crisis usually.
So Michael was talking about, as a nation, how we have become more energy independent. And your vision is for the individual with the refinery on the roof and the gas station in the garage. That's the individual energy independence that we're envisioning. But what about, and I think both of you, have addressed this concern in the past in conversations, what about the concern that are we trading dependence on rare earth metals from China or other countries, Africa, as we move towards electrifying our transportation sector?
And that's an important point. But what a lot of people don't understand is we have huge lithium deposits right here in the United States. The largest lithium deposit discovered so far on planet Earth is in Nevada, in the McDermott caldera. The Salton Sea in California, again, large deposits there, and there are large deposits in Nevada as well. So we have the minerals we need here. Now, in talking to mining executives, what I've heard is that due to environmental laws, we've just gone overseas rather than mess with the red tape here. So we're going to have to balance things. Everything man does causes some environmental damage, and the same will be true of mining. But if we're careful about how we do it, and we're much more conscious of it today than we were, say, 50 years ago, I think we can get these minerals right here sourced at home. We don't have to ship them around the world. Right now, 50% of all the freight rail cars are transporting coal. 50% of the freighters in the ocean are transporting oil. So that's a huge energy drain in and of itself, and a security risk because of the supply chain. Well, this supply chain will start right here at home. Elon Musk is talking about making a lithium refinery right here in Texas. So these are things that the media has blown out of proportion.
If I can make another comment, there is this risk that we're switching strategic liquids and gases for strategic minerals, so we got to be cognizant of that. And there are some different downsides and some upsides on that. Overall, it's a security improvement, but it doesn't take our security risk to zero. So lithium is one on people's minds. We have a lot of lithium, but even if you extract the lithium in a friendly country like Australia or Nevada, it probably goes to China for the refining and upgrading. And so China has a lot of the production and especially a lot of the refining and upgrading. So this is the thing that U.S. Department of Energy, for example, is very nervous about. And this isn't new. I first got a briefing from the Department of Energy in 2007 or 8 about this, where they said, here are the critical minerals we're worried about. Here's the Chinese dominance of the supply chain, especially for the refining and upgrading. Here's why we think this is an issue for the United States. That was in the Bush administration, and that concern carried through the Obama administration and Trump administration. So this is something the government's been aware of and taking action on, and the latest policies really pushed for domestic sourcing. So we do need to be careful about that. The thing I would say, though, I guess there's 2 points. One is the total volumes of minerals we need are far smaller than the total volumes of coal, oil, and gas. So it's like orders of magnitude improvement. I'll give you some numbers in a second. But also, the nature of the risk is different. So today, we will depend on other countries for those same minerals for coal, oil, gas, and nuclear, because coal, oil, gas, and nuclear also need those minerals. They just need fewer of them. You need copper and aluminum and graphite and cobalt, a variety of things. And we depend on other countries, say, for those minerals, and then we also, in some cases, depend on those countries for the fuels themselves. In the United States, we're more secure because we can export, but other countries feel it, same thing like European countries importing gas from Russia, for example. And so that means as you're building your energy system, you depend on other countries to build your system, and then you depend on other countries to operate your system. You have capitalized risk and operationalized risk. But if you switch to wind and solar or whatever for your electric vehicles or the batteries, you have capitalized risk. You might depend on other countries to build your car or your charging station or your solar panels, but then you don't depend on those countries to operate them. Because Vladimir Putin maybe can turn off the supply of gas, but he cannot turn off the sun or the wind. And so you shift the nature of your risk. If bad countries cut off supplies to us, they slow our ability to build the system, but they do not inhibit our ability to operate the system. That's a very important distinction. It means the security risks don't go to zero. It just changes the nature of what it does and how we would respond. The other thing is the total volumes go down dramatically. If you look at the numbers of the minerals we need, I'm especially worried about copper, aluminum, manganese, cobalt, lithium, you name your list of things that we care about. They're not all critical rare earth minerals. One thing I often joke about, Voltaire said about the Holy Roman Empire, it was neither Roman nor an empire and certainly wasn't holy. The same is true about the critical rare earth things. They're not really that rare and they're not really that critical. We can find alternatives and that kind of thing. So I often think about that. At our peak, about a decade or so from now, if we want to get to net zero by 2050, we will need something like 400 million tons per year of these solids we extract from the earth, and then after that it'll go down about maybe 100 to 200 million tons per year. As it stands, we extract 15,000 million tons per year of coal, oil, and gas. And so extracting a couple 100 million tons of solids will let us not have to extract 15,000 million tons of the other fuels. So it's actually a significant drawdown, like 2 orders of magnitude less, if that makes sense, 1/100th of the materials we need. And so that will be less environmental impact. Different impact, though, because it's mining instead of drilling, but we need to be cognizant of that. But generally, an improvement.
Great. Buzz, thinking about the electrification of the transportation sector, what are the challenges and what are the solutions for both individuals, firms, and government as we think about this transition?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is how we've made electric vehicles a political thing. You know, if you tune into certain media channels, you know, they're the Antichrist. If you turn into others, you know, it's the second coming of Jesus. It's somewhere in the middle. And when I sold electric vehicles for a living, and someone would come in and say, hey, I'd like to take a look at one of your plug-in vehicles, I made the terrible mistake of saying, oh, are you concerned about climate change? And they would go, oh, that's that liberal stuff. 50% of the people would walk out of the dealership at that moment. So I found out that it's really not about the environment. Nobody buys a car for the environment. And Consumer Reports has their huge annual survey of car owners. And what they found is in the United States, if you don't know anything about electric vehicles at all, 40% of our citizenry say, I will never own one of those. If you see one in your neighborhood, it drops to 22%. If a friend gets one, 17%. If you ride in one just a few times, 10%. If you drive one just a few times, and they equated it to a kid with his learner's permit, it's 4%. So you go from 40% negative to 4% negative. Now that 4% negative, we may not have an electric answer for them today. It may be heavy-duty towing on a regular basis over long distances. And EVs are not the fit for that yet. I think we will get there. So it makes the most important thing is educating the public and letting them experience these vehicles. You know, get them to go drive one. And when I sold them, I called it butts in seats. You get their butt in the seat of that car, you take them on a back road, you say, punch it to the floor. Because people buy cars for acceleration, cornering, low cost of maintenance, high MPG or MPGE. That's why people buy cars. They don't buy them to save the planet. So we just need to educate the public and give them that experience and let them make the decision and teach them about total cost of ownership. When you look at the price of an EV, they've started out with very high prices. There are quite a few very affordable models right now. But when you factor in the total cost of ownership, they're already competitive with gasoline-powered vehicles.
My electric car, I have a Ford Mustang, Mach-E electric Mustang. It is the quietest, fastest, smoothest car I've ever driven or owned. I love it. It saves me about $1,000 per year on energy costs and maintenance costs. And that's a non-trivial amount of money. It's also, the sticker price for this particular Ford was $15,000 lower than the Shelby Mustang equivalent gasoline version. So I saved $15,000 on the sticker price, not including tax credits. And then $1,000 a year, I'm pretty happy with that financial trade-off. And that's sort of at the high end, but I do think a lot of electric cars should compete with the high-end cars. But then sort of the median buyer, there are these options that are less expensive as well.
Yeah.
So
and what's the electric range?
The electric range is 280 miles. And so I can make it to Houston, charge up overnight and back. I can make it to San Antonio and back on the same charge. And then Dallas, I'd have to charge. So if I go to Dallas or Houston, I got to charge up there, either with a fast charging system or overnight at a hotel or something, or come back. I have to think about it. So the charging infrastructure is not quite like it is with gasoline, where you just stop at whatever Buc-ee's is closest. That's really handy. I think you stayed at the Buc-ee's last night.
Yes, I did.
So we don't quite have the Buc-ee's for electric. In fact, Buc-ee's should add the charging station. I don't know why they haven't. Then you can
some of them. I think there is a Buc-ee's that's putting in some
stop for electricity, buy a $500 smoker and a tent or whatever, and a Big Gulp, and no, not Big Gulp, whatever the Buc-ee's brand. But so you still have to think about the charging infrastructure, but the range is good for my Texas driving. If I want to go to Colorado, you got to do more planning on electric.
So 280 for the Mach-E. This is an unfair question, Buzz, but a Chevy Malibu, what's the gas range on something like a Chevy Malibu that would be equivalent?
You know, don't know it off the top of my head because I quit selling in 2019, but it's probably in the 350-mile range. And that's actually a newbie mistake. Range isn't important. What's important is how fast you can get electricity into that car. And so, you know, the early Chevrolet EVs filled up at 50 kilowatts. And so 50 kilowatts means you're going to sit there for 2.5 hours if you're completely empty and fill it all the way up, and it gives you 259 miles of range. That's unacceptable for a cross-country trip. But there are 250 kilowatt, 350 kilowatt chargers out there, and inexpensive cars, the Hyundai Ioniq 5, the Kia EV6, can charge at these speeds. And so you stop, and before you can finish a hamburger, your car's full. And so I tell people, feed your car when you feed yourself, and charge at night. So when I do long-distance trips, I will stop one time during the day when I have a meal, usually around lunchtime, and charge. And then I'll pick a hotel that has a slow charger and plug in and just go to sleep. I wake up with a full tank just like I do at home. And it's 2 charges a day, and it doesn't affect my trip time because it happens when I was going to stop and eat anyway.
And I start to search the hotel. So Hyatt's, the higher end Hyatt's tend to have chargers. They have the Tesla chargers and the level 2 chargers. And I believe Marriott, I'm not doing a plug for Marriott, but Marriott's website, if you search for a hotel, you can add it as a criterion, and it will tell you which Marriotts have EV chargers. Eventually, I think all the hotels in the few years will tell you whether they have chargers and what kind, that kind of thing.
So as we shift towards electricity, that focuses more attention on the grid. The other thing that's going on with our grid is because of the natural market-driven growth in wind and solar, a much larger share of electricity generated in Texas is now coming from renewables, which makes us even more energy independent. But we're talking about ERCOT and concerns about reliability. How do we think about trading maybe a gasoline shortage for an electricity shortage risks? Is that a concern people should have, or how do we think about that?
Well,
I've got all sorts of thoughts. Why don't I let you go first?
The really cool thing, Texas just had the 1-year anniversary, and California's doing this as well, of a pilot program for a virtual power plant. Yeah. Now, the virtual power plant right now in Texas only uses Tesla Powerwalls in people's garages, but they have the opportunity to sell electricity back to the grid. Well, I can do that with my solar panels. What's the big deal? Well, when I sell my energy back to the grid, my retailer gives me 5 cents a kilowatt hour. When the grid is under strain, electricity can go up to $9 a kilowatt hour, something we pay 10 cents for here. So you're talking almost 100 times what you buy it for. You could sell it back if you can just store it for a while. And so right now, these Tesla Powerwalls are maybe 17 kilowatt hours. They're not big. You have electric vehicles, like the one that I drive, is 75 kilowatt hours. So we are going to get to the point where the virtual power plant not only accesses stationary batteries, but it'll be able to access roving batteries in these cars. And so when we're plugged in, and this will require that the OEMs change the software in the car, that they have vehicle-to-grid capability like the Ford F-150 Lightning does now, but it'll get to the point that everyday citizens like me can do energy arbitrage. And so our cars don't become this depreciating item anymore. It actually becomes an income source for us. And it's proven itself. One gentleman I read about, his electric bill for an entire year was negative $1,000. They paid him for electricity more than he paid for electricity from the grid. So the grid is going to get stabilized. Now, the grid's got to be improved. It's got to be a smarter grid than we have today. But this is coming, and these cars will drive us right in, well, no pun intended, but will drive the market into that.
We just worry about trading gasoline security for electricity security issues, especially as we have more variability on the grid. The grid is already very variable, you don't have the variable squared because of the demand changing with weather and everything else. But if we add in variable supply in addition to the variable demand, it just becomes more complex. This is a solvable problem from an engineering perspective, but it requires different rules or operational procedures. And then on top of that variability, add a lot of growth for data centers, crypto mining, heat pumps, electric vehicles, especially in Texas, electrified oil and gas. So oil and gas industry is leading on electric lift to get oil and gas out of the ground, but also electric compressors to move the fluids along. And now even discussion of electro refining. That's kind of later stage. We're not really there yet, but industry is electrifying, so this means a lot more demand. We got to build a lot of stuff. If you want to make the grid reliable, I think there are generally 4 buckets of solutions. One is build more power plants, so you have enough resource adequacy. The second is expand your transmission system, so your grid is bigger than the weather. We have big weather storms, but our grid can be smaller than the weather sometimes. That happened in the winter storm in February 2021. Use batteries or other ways to store, which is what you're talking about, but also demand response, which could be either using those batteries or turning off appliances like pool pumps or water heaters or things that are unnecessary, maybe even the crypto mining data centers. So we have a variety of loads that are really not that critical we could turn off. And so if you build power plants, expand the grid, use storage, and do demand response, your grid's a lot easier to manage. The Texas answer is we must build more power plants. We kind of ignore the other 3 options, so some of us are screaming from the rooftops, say, well, we have some other tools in our toolkit. Let's use more than just hammers. Let's use hammers and wrenches and screwdrivers and sockets. Let's use all the tools to get the system to work properly. And so we have to get there. EVs are pretty interesting because the way I think about it, electric vehicles either crash the grid or save the grid depending on what time you charge them. And we have some role over that with markets or rates or how you pay people to say, well, charge it now, but not then. And then it becomes a way to improve grid reliability and lower cost. Because we only use our grid on average about 45% of the time. Most of the grid is idle most of the time, except at peak hours. And so if we could use the electric charging at those non-peak times, it lowers the cost for everybody because it amortizes the fixed cost over more kilowatt hours. So there's a lot we can do, but grid reliability is certainly an issue. I'd say the U.S. Department of Defense and military takes it more and more seriously as time goes on. So more and more of the continental bases are developing their own firming or backing power rather than just buying from local utility. Certainly in theater and the forward operating bases, they think about electricity reliability as they have more electric operations with drones and electric equipment and electric weapons and that kind of thing. Right. So electricity reliability will be more pressing concern.
Well, and you just touched on a solution that we haven't said so far, which is microgrids.
Yeah.
Right. And so many military bases are now developing their own. Many communities in systems that either because of fire risk or just unreliability of the existing grids are developing microgrid capabilities, which is another form of energy independence, right, at different scales. You could have the household scale, you could have a small facility or community scale, and then we're thinking about the national level too.
And UT has a microgrid. For a long time, it was the largest microgrid in the world. I think we're number 2 now.
Where is it?
Right here, our 140 megawatt microgrid at UT. With a tour. Okay, you can go see. It's also the most efficient power plant in the world. So we have one.
You're in the right place.
You're in the right place. We have one connection to the Austin grid, which we only use for backup purposes. If we go down, they can sell power to us, but we don't back them up. And we set it up for reliability reasons, frankly. So it's the same kind of thinking. And the military is doing something similar. The military also has special purchasing powers, where unlike other parts of the U.S. government, the military can do 20-year contracts, and the rest of the government does 5-year contracts. So they were an early adopter of solar panels, like at Nellis Air Force Base and that kind of thing, partly to reduce their energy bill, but also with some security ideas in mind.
Terrific. All right. So let's take an opportunity now to hear from you all. If you have questions, let me just ask, please first identify yourself and then direct your question to one of us up here on stage. Who would like to ask a question? We have a question right back here. There you go.
There we go.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Azucena, Associate Director for Research Relations here at the University of Texas. And my question is, as you were describing the microgrid and this ability for us to be able to, quote unquote, store energy and then perhaps sell it back into the market, do you envision a way for us to have, through an app, very futuristic vision of like a Robinhood app or a stock market app where we actually purchase and sell energy, whether it's consumer-based or commercial-based?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think we'll get to a point where you have more participants in the market, which could be the app. Most of us as residential consumers, we just have our electric utility or gas utility sell us our energy and we get our bill at the end of the month. We're not actively engaged in the market for a variety of reasons. You can find ways to participate in the market. There are people who will aggregate participants in the market, but it's usually not the individual. They usually try to aggregate the batteries across the cars or the homes or the rooftop solar panels, the schools, to aggregate supply, and some trader is doing that for you, where they pull together the participation of hundreds of people or dozens of schools or something like that. Yeah. So that's usually the way to go, but I could imagine more peer-to-peer markets and more of this activity. Yeah. I think most people wouldn't want to do it and don't care and who's got time, but some people will be very good at it and there's money to be made for sure.
And I think that there are two thoughts that come to mind. One, there are already some very targeted apps. So you talked about demand response. Ohm Connect and a couple of companies have systems where they will communicate with consumers who've agreed to reduce consumption or even sell power back into the grid. And they get messages, basically. So there's real-time communication there around demand response events. But what we're learning from that is that, back to Michael's comments that people don't care, don't want to be bothered, or it's not quite worth it, automation, smart thermostats, and other kind of smart energy management systems are what we're likely to see, because it's not just households, but even smaller firms, even more sophisticated firms want to be able to just adjust a couple of algorithms that determine how they interact with the grid. And so they don't have to be bothered.
It's a switch on your water heater that anytime the price goes above 20 cents, it turns off or something like that, and you can sell power back. Like some sort of automation would be great. Yeah. That was what we were promised with Smart Grid 1.0 in 2008 and 2009. It never came to be, by the way, but maybe this time we'll get it right.
Hey, Michael. Andy Grimes, Energy Emissions Modeling and Data Lab. And my question is about you talked about the trade-off between mining and drilling, oil and gas versus metals, and the lower environmental impact of mining because of the order of magnitude. But can you comment on the, I guess, recyclability aspect of the metals?
Yeah.
And what the percentage throughput of recyclability is today and the prospects of that increasing in the future?
Yeah, no, great question. I want to clarify, mining is not zero impact. It is a different kind of impact. It's usually not a greenhouse gas impact. It's a topographic impact, a land impact, and potentially a water impact, depending on how you have the runoff. The largest abundance of materials we deal with are primarily around steel and iron, aluminum, and copper. All are recyclable and are recycled for the most part today. In fact, in the United States, our steel recycling is the dominant source of where we get steel. We have very little virgin steel in the United States. In China, they have virgin steel and recycled steel, partly because they're in a different kind of growth mode, but that's easily recycled, can be, and if you look into Europe, they have end-of-life recycling rules that we'll probably have in the United States in about a decade. And so for the major components that happens, wearing my venture fund hat, so I'm also at a clean tech venture fund, we've invested in a company that does copper recycling, taking out of old motors and things like that. So for the largest materials, recycling's pretty standard and not that hard, and it's been around for a long time, and I expect more of that. If we really get desperate, we'll start drilling in landfills for some of it might be easier to get some materials from there. Lithium's one that's on people's mind because now that's a growing volume, still a fraction compared to copper, aluminum, and steel and iron. But lithium's growing, and lithium recycling capacity has grown alongside it. In fact, a lot of the lithium recycling capacity in the world right now is idle because we have more lithium recycling capacity than demand for lithium recycling, partly because we built up the batteries take 10 years, so I think we'll catch up at some point. And you can do it, that's a little harder than for the other metals. And then you get to the more exotic stuff, cobalt or whatever, I think that will be even harder, but the volumes are smaller. I think we'll need to get there. Probably we'll have regulations, probably we need regulations. And I think Europe's really leading on that. I think if you buy a car in Europe, it's required by law to be like 99% recyclable or something like that. And so you can't just landfill it or put it in a junkyard. You actually have to go extract the materials back out. And that can be done. For the embedded electronics or the exotic battery chemistries, it's a little harder, but you can still do it.
And on the recycling of the batteries, for an electric vehicle, when the battery is no longer suitable for transportation, your range has dropped so much that it's no longer, and this, we're talking, 10, 15 years into use, it can then be shifted to things like battery backup for data centers. So the batteries can still be usable. Maybe 10 years after that, we look at recycling, and as he mentioned, 99% of the EV battery today, the technology exists to recycle those batteries, and oddly enough, the recycled lithium performs better than lithium that's freshly mined. So I believe that in the future, one of the things we'll see once we've reached peak adoption of electric vehicles is the mining will actually start to drop off, because instead of mining out of the ground, we're going to mine from these existing batteries being recycled.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for the very inspiring discussion. So my name is Yunus Alami. I'm from UM6P in Morocco. And my question was actually related to recycling, but I have a second question, which is about technologies, battery technologies today. So we're talking about NMC, LFP, sodium technologies, and so on. But a lot of those are more suitable probably for stationary applications rather than high-power applications like electric vehicles. So what's your take on the development of those technologies for the future electrical vehicle applications?
For batteries in particular?
Yes.
So right now, the world is settled on lithium-ion batteries as a solution for a variety of supply chain and performance reasons. You can get a lot of energy density, it's pretty light, so lithium-ion is great for mobile applications or our smartphones, that kind of thing. As a consequence of the supply chains being built out for EVs and smartphones, we also use lithium-ion for stationary applications, which is a grid for which we don't really need lithium-ion. We don't need a lightweight battery for a stationary application. By stationary, I mean like out at the distribution grid or out at the power plants, that kind of thing. And so you can use more chemistries. We just happen to use lithium because the prices drop so much because of this other market. And we'll see if that continues to be the ongoing winner in the markets. There are other chemistries. Iron air is very interesting for long duration storage. It's not as light, but it lasts a lot longer. Basically, you rust and derust the iron to get an electrochemical reaction. And there are a lot of people here at the University of Texas and elsewhere looking at sodium batteries. because they have different performance features. Sodium is more abundant, it's cheaper, but also it's safer. It doesn't have the risk of dendrites or thermal runaway. Lithium batteries are highly active, which is great, but they can catch on fire, which is not great. And so finding batteries that are battery chemistry more thermally stable or more abundant or safer or doesn't require China to refine and upgrade for you is pretty interesting. And so sodium jumps to people's minds for that. Maybe get sodium sulfur or something else, and then solid state electrolytes, and you get smaller. So there's a lot of innovation. I feel like we're still in the early days of batteries. I know batteries have been around for almost 200 years, but it feels like now we're putting money into those very particular innovations. And the interesting thing, which had a great conversation yesterday with a few researchers at UT, using artificial intelligence to combine with robotics to expedite the materials discovery process. So a lot of materials it's like baking or a recipe where you try a recipe, then you bake it, and you see how it performs, and you try again, do it over and over again. And it takes a human to do this. So using robotics to automate it, do 100 different recipes at a time. And then using artificial intelligence to go through thousands and thousands of published literature to discover which materials you should then bake and test with your robotics. That could take the human out of the loop in a way that expedites, where one human can do many hundreds or thousands of tests, and artificial intelligence can scan thousands or tens of thousands of opportunities. And so if we do that, we'll probably find far more options than even the ones we just talked about. So I think that's one of the most exciting applications of AI, is accelerating materials discovery for better batteries or better membranes or better conductors to replace the copper or whatever. And I think batteries will be one of the early use cases of that.
Yeah. I'll get sort of back to the ramifications of the oil embargo. So over the last 50, 60 years now, what kind of social or political transformations that were made as a response to the oil embargo and perhaps in 1979 Iranian Revolution, what kind of things are still with us that are good, like organizations we made or policies we made, and what kind of things are maybe around that maybe we don't need anymore? Is there an organization around that we don't need anymore? And kind of what the difference between, also the difference between maybe the social contract between workers and businesses. I mean, this kind of changed, from a public policy perspective. There's a lot of changes in wages and relationships of companies and profits and workers' wages that changed in the 1970s. So any kind of thoughts on the social and sort of real geopolitical changes that are still with us and whether they still need to be?
That's a rich question. I'm sure you'll have comments, but I got a couple things come to mind, not necessarily on wages and labor contracts, although there was a massive shift in the 70s. The United States became much less energy intensive on industry, partly because of efficiency, partly because we started to offshore more industry in response to the high prices. But there are two policy outcomes in the 70s that both might be dated, but one is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve you mentioned earlier. We created in response to the oil crises that looks less and less critical as time goes on, or less and less strategic, and it's more political to manage prices. Maybe that's a reasonable use for it, but that wasn't the original intended design. And the International Energy Agency was created partly to coordinate the strategic petroleum reserves of all the nations around the world, and that seems less and less like a good purpose for the IEA. Now the IEA is there mostly to do reports and data, it feels like, because managing the strategic petroleum reserves just feels kind of unnecessary in data. So that's one thing I wonder if we really need. Another one is the Carter Doctrine, a foreign policy doctrine, where Jimmy Carter said, we have a right to go to war over oil because it's in our national interest. That Carter Doctrine is still here. It has been used to justify a lot of engagements in the Middle East, and I'm wondering if that will, is it already dated? Do we need that still? Do we need to go to war over oil? But Carter gave us that permission, sort of, so to speak, with foreign policy that we then used in the 90s. President Bush used it in the early 90s to invade Iraq, to defend Kuwait, because oil stability was in the national interest, and having a large presence of the U.S. Navy in the Persian Gulf is justified partly by the Carter Doctrine. So there's a few things I wonder, like, okay, do we need those? They're 50 years old almost now. Are they still relevant? And then we also had this massive shift of the industry in the 70s, and we lost a lot of jobs. So a lot of the decline in jobs in the 80s with the Rust Belt and elsewhere that we still feel the political consequences of today happened in response to the changing offshoring norms of manufacturing in the 70s. So I feel like there's still ramifications cascading through society. We're starting, because of the energy situation, we're starting to onshore things again, or re-onshore. So maybe it's changing, but I don't know. I feel like that's tied in with like weakening unions. There's a lot of other things that happened in the 70s around that time, and I feel like JR knows a lot more about this than I do, but you probably have some thoughts also.
Well, Buzz, did you have any thoughts on the question?
Well, I think in the policy world, one of the things we've got to start looking at is how the labor market is going to change. You know, if there is a decline in oil and gas, especially in how it's used in the electricity sector. We're going to have people, and just to give you some background, first 10 years of my career, I was born and raised in Houston. I was in oil and gas. Last 10 years of my career has been electric vehicles. So I'm kind of what's happening to Texas. And so in '85, when the price of oil collapsed, my family lost everything. We lost our home. You could not get a job in Texas. Houses down the street went on auction, and people bought them with their credit cards. So that sort of economic shakeup, could happen again if we don't plan for it. If you can climb up on an oil derrick and do work, you can climb up on a wind turbine and build that. If you're a welder on a pipeline, you can be a welder on our infrastructure. There are some job skills that are going to be transferable easily into this new industry. There are others that aren't. So I think one of the policies our government's got to come up with is re-education. My grandfather worked for the same company his entire life. My dad worked in the same industry all his life, but for multiple companies. I've worked in several industries in my career. That's what this future is going to be, and education. And I love the University of Texas is doing this. Education and continuing education throughout your career is going to become critical. We've always talked about companies having to be nimble. You have to be nimble in your career and be prepared for whatever the next wave happens, because especially with AI, these changes are going to happen faster and faster, and they're going to be striking. And so for you to be relevant in this society and in your job, you got to surf the waves. You've got to stay prepared. And our government, I think, has to help us with this. You can't do it at night school if you're raising a family. You've got to be able to take a year or two sabbatical to learn the new job skills to move into new industries. And the only way to do that might be a government savings account where you're putting money away, sort of like an IRA that you can draw out of later to take that year off to get those new skills.
So before we get to our last questioner, just in response, Carrie, I think one of the things that's happening is a shift in focus to electrical utilities. As we use electricity as a feedstock for the transportation sector and for industry increasingly, and they're now the place where we're managing a variety of extreme weather shocks, extreme heat, drought, cold. They're just so. We've moved from a world in which utilities kind of happened behind the scenes. Nobody even looked at what their electric bill was when they got it each month because it never changed. You just forgot about it and factored it into your budget. It's become really a center of critical decision making for both meeting the needs of communities and making communities more resilient. So I think institutionally, our shift towards energy independence has put more pressure on the state and local governance of the electric utility and the broader state grid. And I think when you look at the employment effects, you see the same thing. You see a shift in employment away from extraction and refining, and in many states already in the western part, and much more of a focus on how our electric utility workforce is preparing themselves and are they ready, and a lot more negotiating with unions where they exist. So let's take our last question over here.
Hey, good morning. Fantastic discussion. I'm Jared Ware from the Railroad Commission of Texas. Previously worked critical infrastructure policy. Now I'm working on geothermal and carbon capture and sequestration. So my question is, what are the big strategic policy issues that you see that we need to do to continue this progress toward energy independence?
I love that. Well, geothermal is a great opportunity in the United States, and it might not happen in great scale in Texas early on, but the companies are likely to be Texas-based companies or leverage Texas-based expertise. I think one of the advantages we have in Texas is the ability to get projects built, and I think that's a key thing that if we build it, they will come. And we've been, despite the rhetoric that's anti-wind or anti-solar, building a lot of wind and solar, and despite the anti-battery rhetoric, we've been building a lot of batteries. So I think the fundamental advantage we have and that we should keep going is let's build stuff. Let's not put up prohibitions to building things. And that includes pipes and wires and drills and you name it, and subsurface caverns for storing either hydrogen or sequestering CO2, you name it. And I think that's really a great ability that other states and other countries don't have. So I think that's our key advantage. Let's keep doing that. I also think it's worth putting a price on pollution. Right now you can pollute for free. I don't think you should do that. I think you should put a price on pollution. I also think you should put a value on reliability. And so people complain about the lack of reliability of certain forms of energy. Well, you maybe don't punish them, but you reward those who are reliable, those who show up when we need them most. So you can have reliability markets, say in the power market, where you are rewarding people who show up, and then you have pollution fees, so you punish people who are dirty. I think if we use the efficiency of the markets and the ability to build stuff, we'll be in pretty good position.
Buzz?
I don't know that I have much to add to that.
Okay. Yeah, I think pricing carbon is probably the most important policy decision, but you know, one of the things that we want to be able to do, to just build off what Michael said, is allow our energy markets to work in all areas. So whether that's hydrogen or carbon capture and sequestration, we need to make sure that they're not regulatory obstacles to sort of energy, all of the above, as sets of solutions. And you know, one of the things that people don't appreciate is that companies need regulatory certainty in those areas. And right now, Texas is competing with Louisiana for a lot of these kind of emerging technologies. And one of the advantages that Louisiana has is they have primacy now, and they can you know, certify class 6 wells, and so companies need a sort of regulatory partner they can trust, where there's stability and there's transparency. And I think in terms of Texas remaining a sort of a competitive leader, we need to make sure that there's regulatory certainty there for all of our energy firms as we move forward. And I think I know that's kind of in the weeds, but it's actually a big headache for a lot of investors who want to invest in these energy technologies here in Texas and are not sure what tomorrow's going to bring. They can go to Louisiana and they know exactly what they're going to get. So I think that's a big, important challenge.
So with that, let's thank our excellent panelist and moderator.